Welcome everyone to a talk on Civilization 6. I'm Ed Beach from Firaxis Games. I've been the lead designer on Civilization 6 that was released last October. My talk here is going to run about 45 minutes, giving us some time for questions at the end. I want to thank the GDC folks for the way they scheduled things this morning. They put Sid Meier's Civ 1 post-mortem talk right before mine, so it got all the Civ fans here before. How many people actually came to that talk as well? Okay, so actually a good percentage of the audience. Just wanted to invite you to take one more talk with me right now. So in that Civ tradition, we'll take another turn here and move forward. Now jumping forward into the future 25 years and talking about Civilization 6. One of the things I'm going to focus on during my talk is about how many people have opinions about Civilization games and about Civilization 6. So I'm sure there are quite a few opinions out there in the audience, and so I've been told that we can even spill over a little bit on time at the end if we want to, fielding questions. So if anyone does have questions, I'm happy to take them at the end, and we can dive into things in as much detail as you want. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is just give everyone a quick refresher on the Civilization series.
In the beginning, the earth was without form and void. The sun shone upon the sleeping earth. Into this swirling maelstrom of fire, air, and water, the first stirrings of life appeared. The seeds of life grew and strengthened, spread and diversified. Now it required but one more ingredient: a great leader, to unite the quarreling tribes, to harness the power of the land, to build a legacy that would stand the test of time. A civilization.
So Civilization has now been 6 games, 25 years, 5 lead designers, dozens of intro movies, and quite a few animated leaders, some of them a little slicker than others. I've seen the last 8 of those years and served as the lead designer since the Gods and Kings and Brave New World expansions to Civ 5. But that still means that when we started the process for Civ 6 design, the Civ series itself had been around 7 times longer than I'd been a lead designer. So taking the reins of this series was definitely a daunting proposition. To add to the pressure, Civ 5 launched in 2015. And one thing that you'll note about Civ 5 is it spent all 6 years right there in the top 10 most played games on Steam. This screenshot is actually from the Steam stats page 1 week before Civ 6 released. And you could see Civ 5 was doing quite well, still very healthy and in 3rd place there. An additional factor going into releasing Civ 6 last year was that 2016 was going to be the 25th anniversary of Civ 1. So we're going to have 25 years of the same franchise, and there was a lot of attention, both in the media and in our marketing, devoted to that 25th year anniversary. You can see here, we have a picture of Bruce Shelley and Sid, who just did the previous talk. Meeting with some of the other early Civ lead designers at the DICE Summit in Las Vegas. It was about a year ago, last February, and that was sort of a focal point for that conference, was that panel where they were doing a retrospective on Civ. We also had a big marketing campaign that rolled out as the year was going on. You can see here at E3 last year in LA, we had Civilization 6 themed stairways leading into the convention center. We had a theater presentation narrated by Sean Bean, who you just heard in the trailer I just played for you. And there were a bunch of media events that were happening associated with Civ 6, including our first event held on Facebook Live, where we did a Q&A session with our community manager and sort of answered a lot of the early questions about what Civ 6 was going to be. That session alone attracted a lot of attention. We definitely realized it was picking up some hits on Facebook when we had a certain man with 86 million followers on Facebook tune right into the stream and tell us, Civ 6, I'm looking forward to it. So it's an intense year. I definitely, as being the lead designer for the first time, had a whole bunch of interesting experiences. But I did look forward to getting at least a slight break from the action in the middle of the summer because one of the things I like to do every year is go to a World Board Gaming Championships and both play and run some of the board gaming tournaments there. So got this 3-4 day break, went to that tournament, and one of the things that I noticed was the Civ 6 hoopla followed me right into this event. So one of the lighter, more casual events I attend each year at this convention is it's really a comedy show disguised as a trivia game hosted by John Corrado, who's kind of a friend of mine who I'm showing you on the screen here. John knew ahead of time that I was going to be there. And he kind of asked me early in the week, he's like, you going to be there? Okay, you don't mind if I bring up Civ 6 a little bit? And I was like, sure, go ahead, whatever you want to say, that's fine. Well, I was in the audience. In fact, I was right there in the audience. And John made had no hesitation about pointing that out to people and sort of diving in, like, we've got a Civ 6 lead designer here right now. And he actually used it as a platform to kind of get across his message that there's absolutely no pressure on you, Ed, but I love Civ 5, and if you mess up Civ 6, you're in big, big trouble. So even on my breaks, I was having trouble getting away from the Civ 6 hoopla. The only consolation I got out of that was in this particular event, since he had themed it around Civilization 6 because he wanted to highlight my presence there, I did get a few categories that he chose for trivia that were sort of right up my alley. So we had 100 most played games on Steam. And then the one that I definitely aced, just sort of ran that category right away. So yeah, I know a little bit about the wonders of the ancient world by now. So maybe there was a little bit of pressure here. With that in mind, I kind of want to dive into, with a backdrop like this, with a successful series that's been around for 25 years, how was our team going to go ahead and attack this project? How would anyone designing the next game in a hit series proceed? So one other thing I noticed was that this question of how do you proceed in a hit series was something that a lot of people were wondering about. In all those press interactions at E3 and in some of the other interviews we were doing last year, it was a repeated question. They kept saying, how are you going to find anything to add 6 games into the series? And so I started thinking about, that is something that's perplexing to a lot of people. It's something that, is going to be applicable to lots of people in the game industry because so much of our work and our titles are based around the fact that we have an established franchise and we have to add on to it and augment it. And so that's why I got the idea that, yeah, maybe this is a worthy topic to address here at GDC. So I actually found it sort of an interesting question because we had adopted a process that we'd used kind of first with the Gods and Kings expansion. And it sort of made that question not as difficult as it seemed like the press was feeling like it should be. Because what we wanted to do when we were creating sort of any successor in the Civilization series, whether it's an expansion pack like Gods and Kings or whether it's Civilization 6, is we want to really take a hard look at what we had done previously and think about, as game players, as game designers, what is working and what's not working. And we did that as part of our development process for Gods and Kings. We may not have had a whiteboard in the office that had exactly these lists of 4 items, but we certainly came up with lists of items. These 4 items were all on them, and we do a lot of internal discussion. We have an external beta test team that is sort of like community leaders and giant fans of the series. Some of them have been working with us for 2 or 3 titles in the series, maybe even longer. And we're sort of always looking at our game and what's working and what's not. So just a couple examples from these Civ 5 expansion packs. In Gods and Kings, we were seeing that the combat wasn't balanced the way it should be. There were cases where because the rule of combat was every time you made an attack, you were always going to do 1 hit point of damage, no matter how weak you were. We were having situations where 10 archers in the ancient realm could still be around facing something like a giant death robot in the modern times. And as long as you had 10 of them, you could take that giant death robot down. So one of the things we introduced for Gods and Kings was a 100 hit point scale to better balance combat. We had a problem that we were thinking we wanted to attack with the Civ 5 base game, where players would get into a game world, they get into a situation, and they might have picked a civilization to play that just wasn't a very good fit, or there wasn't any way for them to kind of customize the bonuses that they got so that they would really be adapted well for the terrain around their initial cities and for the type of victory they might want to pursue. And in Gods and Kings, we were able to address that by adding a religion system. We also saw that there wasn't that much awareness of what the AI was doing, that there was a lot going on in the depths of a Civ 5 game that the AI was taking place in, but people weren't seeing that. And so we added an espionage system to address that. And then finally, the problem that we had was that the naval units, they were all attacking as ranged units. They were very one-dimensional. They weren't much threat to anyone's city because they weren't allowed to take it. And so for that expansion, we added melee naval units. And this process of sort of self-examination and becoming critics of our own games and using those as springboards to figure out what capabilities we were going to put into the expansion was something that we just kept going with. So we went into Brave New World, and Brave New World, again, we made a list of items that we thought were still not working right in Civ 5, even with the Gods and Kings expansion. We felt like the culture victory was kind of bland. It was just finish a certain number of social policy trees and then do 1 building project. So we added a tourism and great work system to address that. We didn't like that with the new base movement rate of 2 spaces in Civ 5 that the exploration game ended so quickly. So we wanted to add more exploration later in the game, and we added an archaeology system to address that. We felt like the diplomatic victory was pretty bland. It was just a matter of kind of spending a lot of money on city-states, and that was a, people called it an economic victory instead of a diplomatic victory, because it's really how much money you had. And when we added the World Congress for Brave New World, it really made that part of the game more interesting. And then there are a couple more items. You can see the economic interdependencies didn't become as rich and as important until we added trade routes. And then that sort of final push to victory, the climax at the end of the game, the tension in the 20th century was addressed with our ideology system. So you can see again here, it was a matter of kind of really taking stock of where we were at, looking at what was working, what wasn't working. That was the way we got those expansions to kind of flesh out the Civ 5 experience and give you, exactly what you get now when you play Civ 5 Complete. So that's sort of where we started the Civ 6 work. We looked at how we had proceeded with those expansions. We looked at how they were a matter of itemizing issues and then using that as a springboard to move forward. And we felt like even though Civ 5 was very successful, was still being played a lot on Steam, it was not a perfect game. There was plenty of opportunities to find places where we could improve it. And so we started going about making our list of what we wanted to address for Civ 6. Now, one way that we really push this further is I have to continue to give shout outs to our community. We have a very engaged community, a very passionate community, but one thing that they always are good about is they're never short about giving us opinions. And so it's always easy for us to go up there and, if we're wondering about which civs are overpowered or underpowered with the current release, they've already produced a list for us and itemized all that for us. If they're telling us, if they want to tell us, which system they like better in Civ 4 and which one went way downhill in Civ 5 and is only finally making a all that data is up there. So I see posts now and again where the community people are like, did Firaxis ever read this forums? I don't think they're paying any attention to us. That's totally ridiculous because I have a whole office of designers that spend way too much of their day reading the forums. Sometimes I have to pull and don't read the forums right now. We need to buckle down and get going. So one thing that I did when I was looking at what they thought about Civ 5, and this is the strategy forum for Civ 5 just yesterday afternoon. I just pulled it down and pasted it in here just so you can kind of see it's still hotly debating things about how to get to the science victory as fast as possible and posting guides for players who are trying to win on Immortal and Deity. One thing we noticed is that they had looked at the tech tree and they had all sorts of plans for exactly how you attack the tech tree. What is the optimal strategy? I'm not going to swear that this is the right optimal strategy. This is just one I pulled off Civ Fanatics yesterday, but I found it interesting because with the arrows there and everything, it's sort of a perfect example for me of how people found Civ 5 to sort of be a solved problem. They kind of identified this one overarching problem that we kept coming up against, and that was that there was just a single path to victory that would always get you through the game successfully. Didn't necessarily matter which map type, which victory type you're going. If you follow, I think it's 5 little mantras that I've got here that I got from the community, you were able to be successful and win a Civ 5 game. So let's look at those. Build only 4 cities. Rush to the National College. Science is king. Tradition for your social policies, never liberty. And get to rationalism as soon as you can. So those, there are probably more that the community focused on, but these were the kind of things I kept seeing over and over again. I kept going there, and these were sort of the magic recipe to get you to a successful conclusion in a Civilization 5 game. And this was the #1 thing I wanted to address for Civilization 6, is I wanted to be sure that players were going to have to think on their feet. They were not going to be able to use a couple key points every time. There was going to be situations that the game was going to throw at them that they were going to have to react to. They're going to have to think on their feet. So you'll see as we go through the talk that that's sort of my #1 principle in terms of guiding us to what we're going to change for Civilization 6, how we're going to change it, and then we'll wrap up at the end today and you'll kind of see how there was one key component to solving this problem. So I started thinking about solutions, and I'll sort of give away what the key component is right now, but how it works into all the different things that we came up with is what we'll end up diving into more deeply. So in order to come up with a solution to this problem about players being able to always use the same strategy to win, we had to look at what changes every time you play a Civilization game. Because it's those things that are changing that are going to force players to think on their feet. If they're presented with a situation that doesn't look like what they were faced with in the previous game, they're going to have to adjust. So I love the Civilization series. It's the perfect game for me working on because I love history, but also because I love maps. And what changes every time you play is the map. And that's sort of the most exciting time for, I think, a lot of Civilization players. There are a lot of people who say, I play the beginning, see what the map looks like, explore it. I may not finish that game because it's just so exciting to get back to that point where I get to start a new game again and explore the map again and dive back in. So I knew that the map was sort of the key to what makes the civilization magic work. Sid and Bruce Shelley talked about that a little bit in their talk about how important it was to stick with randomizing the map every single time. And so that was going to be sort of the centerpiece of the solution for Civilization 6. So what I'm going to do right now is we're going to start taking a deeper dive. We're going to go into those areas on Civilization 5 that I felt like we needed to make improvements. So we're going to dive into 5 different areas. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify sort of what I see as the problem in Civ 5, and then talk about how we solve that for 6. So the first area I want to look at is how tiles are used outside the city. And I looked at how they were being used in Civ 5, and I felt like those decisions were kind of lacking. I call them rote decisions because there wasn't a lot of thought being put into it. So if you look at this particular screenshot, it's just nothing special. I just grabbed like the first Civ 5 screenshot I could find off the internet. But I started looking at the improvements outside this city, and you see, okay, farms are placed on the flat land, especially if they're near the river. You've got mines anywhere there are hills or resources that require mines. The resources that require a special improvement, like a plantation or a camp, they get that improvement. And pretty much all those choices are automatic. You don't have to think about what you're doing with those tiles. It's just automatic. There is one thing that we added for Civ 5 that was sort of a nice hint at where we might be going for Civ 6. That last arrow that is put down in the corner, that's showing you a academy, which is a great person building. And those sort of went into any tile that you wanted. And the kind of interesting thing about that was it was sort of always was one of your leftover spaces, whatever you considered like the least useful area you're going to use for that. But at least it was, you had to scan all the tiles around your city to try to figure out which was the best place for it. And that was sort of what we decided we wanted people to be doing much more frequently in Civ 6. It was like having to look around all their city tiles, look at all the possible places, and then choose where their next move is going to be made. So that's exactly where we went with Civ 6. And this is actually our unstacked city system. That was a change that we were sort of dying to try even when we were in Civ 5 development. We had really pressed, our development team really had pressed John Schaefer, the Civ 5 lead, to try to put the wonders out on the map. We knew the art would look a lot better. We knew it would be interesting in terms of placement decisions. But I think John made the right call. There was a lot going on already with Civ 5. We had taken the combat system and moved it out onto the map and unstacked all that with 1 unit per tile. And it would have been just too much change at once. But these unstacked cities, probably 2 years before we started Civ 6, I knew that this was going to be one of our #1 features for that game. So you can see in this particular example, if you haven't played Civ 6, sort of how this works. We have a science campus up here, nestled up against the mountains. We have a commercial hub along the river, a holy site. It's also inspiring for religious worship to have a mountain backdrop, so that's a good place to put it up against the mountains. And then also the 4th item here, the Hagia Sophia, that's one of the wonders outside the city. And so what I think is so interesting about the way this works is now, rather than there's one use for every tile with those tile improvements that I was showing you for Civ 5, we actually have at least 3 different layers of items that go outside your city, both the tile improvements from Civ 5, these new districts that I'm showing you, because we pulled the buildings out of the city and put them out into the districts, and then wonders as well have to go outside the city. So now you have those 3 competing layers, and they're all looking for a spot outside the city. And now every time you're building in the city, you're having to make choices and trade-offs about how you're going to use each of your tiles. You can actually say that for a lot of our civilizations, we make it even worse for you because we add in unique improvements for that civilization. So like the Egyptians get the Sphinx, the Sumerians get the ziggurat, and now you sort of have a 4th layer where I'm going to fit in unique improvements into this jumble. And then we said, well, there might be some civilizations that don't get unique improvements, so what are we going to do for them? They need to have that same just torturous situation as a player trying to figure out how to use every tile. So what we did is we went ahead and created some city-states that also, if you are allied with that city-state, you get to temporarily use their ability to create unique improvements. So we have the colossal head unique improvement that's allowed outside the city. So maybe if your civilization doesn't even have unique improvements, you can go ahead and have to worry about them. So this is actually, it doesn't always happen in game development, but this is a system where we sort of had this pent-up desire to put it in. We tried it in Civilization 6 in some of our earliest prototypes years before we actually got to 2016 and shipped it, and it worked right away. So definitely a success, but I'll get to some areas where we struggled quite a bit more. Okay, so problem number 2 that I identified from Civ 5 was the way the tech tree worked. And if you came to the Sid's talk earlier, you saw that the tech tree has been a huge part of Civilization. It's pretty much worked the same way from Civ 1 all the way through to Civ 5. And we kind of looked at it as a place where not much innovation had happened. Maybe we should look at it. And there was one thing about the technology tree that had always bothered me in Civilization games. So let's focus on that for a second. So let's look at sort of the same screenshot I had up before, but now we're going to drill into the top of the tree and look at the sailing line. And you can see sailing and optics are both technologies there. Now, sailing takes 13 turns, calendar takes 17 turns. It really doesn't matter what's going on in my game world. Those are always going to be proportionally take the same amount of time. My people have just as good an opportunity to get into sailing as calendar, even if I'm in the middle of the biggest continent you've ever seen and my people have never seen the ocean. And that just didn't make any sense to me. How are you guys learning about sailing when you have no water anywhere near your civilization? It just felt like the tech tree was often this own disjoint universe that had nothing to do with what was going on in your actual game world. Why shouldn't those two be married together? Why shouldn't they have some interdependencies? The technology and the research of your people just needs to be something that is inherently tied to what they have done so far and what they're about to do. So we looked at that. And one thing that we came up with was it would be very interesting to go ahead and come up with a system where you could trigger things by doing actions with either your units or your cities out there in the game world that was gonna be sort of gameplay directed actions that help you with this path through the game, with your progression through the technology tree. So that's how sailing came to have a boost. Go ahead and found a city on the coast, and all of a sudden, what we're going to do is fill up that half of that circle you see there. So 50% of the credit towards the sailing technology research is going to be given to you for free if you can get a city on the coast. And we started out, it was tricky at first because the first time I sat down and was looking at the ancient and classical tech trees and I had to come up with boosts for all of them, I was like, I got the sailing one nailed, but there are another 20 technologies here, and what's going to make sense? And that probably took me a full day and a half, 2 days to come up with just the first cut at what that would be. And we put that in the game, and we played it that way for probably 3 or 4 months just to make sure that the system was working. And everyone liked it right away, which was great. It led to sort of more directed play early in the game. It gave you sub goals. It sort of even gave us a way to tutorialize things. Like if players aren't going to find a trade route because they just never really found that particular unit, well, maybe we put it on the boost that you get a boost for making a trade route. And now all of a sudden people are like, oh, okay, I got to figure out how to make a trade route. That's going to be important to me. And so it had a whole bunch of positive outcomes that we were seeing right away. We were really excited about it. But I knew that I'd only spend that day and a half, 2 days to do the ancient and classical boosts, and I knew I had a whole 5, 6 more epics worth of boosts I was going to have to come up with. I kept putting that off. Probably it was like 6 or 9 months later, I actually got around to doing boosts for the whole tree. And it was a little tough, but we ended up finding a pattern that you look for things that you had unlocked recently. And if you haven't used those things, even though you've unlocked them, then perhaps you shouldn't be moving on to the more advanced technologies. So it took a little while for us to figure out how to apply this kind of kernel of an idea that worked really well in the ancient era throughout all of history. But overall, this was definitely a success and something that we didn't struggle with too much. But now I'm going to get into something where we did struggle. And the problem here, I already alluded to it before when I put up those mantras of the Civ 5 players. Go to tradition, never go into liberty. Rush to rationalism as fast as you can. This social policy tree, we loved a lot of things it did. It was very thematic in terms of giving you things that culture could unlock for your civilization and give you boosts. It was really sort of an integral part of what had happened with Brave New World with our ideology system. So we didn't want to throw this out. We wanted to keep the idea of social policies being items that could give you, specialized boost in a certain direction. But there were a couple problems that we felt like we had to address. And I think the number one thing that we wanted to attack here in terms of social policies was we had sort of lost something that had been in the series previously with Civilization 4. In Civilization 4, you had been able to, what a lot of players called pivot their government. So something dramatic had happened. You went to war, you weren't expecting it, or you're coming back from a war and you have to kind of rebuild your economy. You could switch out CIVICS, go back to things that you had focused on before, maybe jump ahead to things you haven't had before, but there was this sort of ability to kind of retune the way your society was working, the way your government was set up, and that sort of gave players a lot of sense of control and sort of like they were making policy decisions sort of like a government leader would in charting the future for their empire. So that was sort of a good thing that Civ 4 had that we lost in Civ 5 because once you made a choice on a social policy on one of these trees, it was locked in. And what was worse is once you jumped into one of these trees and started developing it, we gave you a big incentive to finish it. So we sort of locked in not only the choice of that one social policy that gets you into the tree, but we sort of encourage you to make a commitment to keep going on that tree till you're finished. And that ended up just not being as configurable and as flexible as what we wanted. So for Civilization 6, what we started out with actually looked a little bit like this. Now this is just in Visio. The next few slides were unearthed from the archaeology system that is our design docs and going back and pulling out screenshots from them. But you can see here what the Civ 6 CIVICS system, and yes, that is a tongue twister. We realized that right away. We were going to have problems pronouncing that. But the Civ 6 CIVICS system started with this design for social policies. Now, some of it survived. You can see right away it had military policies in sort of the orangish red and economic policies in the gold, and the wild card and diplomatic policies we ended up with, those were around from the beginning and we stuck with it. It had all these little sort of aqua blue unlocks associated with every single social policy. And it was similar to our boost system. I think we were too enamored with our tech boost system at this point, and we were going to make everything in the game unlock with that. And so why not every single social policy have a different unlock? Because we could come up with something that made sense for everything, right? So many unlocks, just way too many unlocks. It was. I don't even think we got this implemented before we started realizing there's just too much cognitive overload on the player. There's no way they're going to be able to remember what they're pursuing. We did pair this with a list of governments that we wanted to have. And this, we changed a few of the names around, but this set of governments and the fact that governments have different numbers of policy slots, that stuck through. But what we found with our players with this first system was they didn't know what they were doing in terms of how they were supposed to be progressing through that tree. There were things like we had this Imperium government. It sounded really cool. Maybe they should stick in that for a long time. Are they supposed to go through all, some players thought they should go through all 9 in order. And, that's switching governments way more than we thought people should be doing. So it was just a little too chaotic, and the progression path through these governments was unclear. So we didn't throw out all of this. We kept some of the code, but we had to redesign, refactor some things. And so our second try at the CIVICS system, we did add government tiers so that you could kind of at least get a sense that these three governments were all more powerful than where you started, but they might be they were more on a par with each other, so that you could kind of pick one and you don't have to feel bad that you skipped the other two. And that just sort of made sense to players that with it tiered like this, we were anticipating you were going to switch governments at least 3 times during the game. And with this tier structure, all of a sudden, that just sort of fell into place. So that was a nice change. But we did have kind of this weird construct that we borrowed from Brave New World for how you get into the different tiers. We sort of were forcing an upgrade when a certain dramatic event happened in the game. And we actually kept the exact trigger for the last 3 governments that once you get a certain number of factories in your empire, you're going to have a big working class, and they were going to just dictate that you have to govern them with one of the 20th century ideological governments. And we sort of felt like this interesting decision about what government you're in, that we were trying to make kind of cool and fun, and a new thing that was going to be introduced for Civ 6 was kind of fighting against these forced upgrades that we were putting in play every time you hit one of these tiers. So we tried to relax that in our next version, CIVICS system version 3. And this one was notable because now we finally put in bonuses for the governments. We thought that if you get to pick maybe you've unlocked the tier 2 governments, but you really like that tier 1 government, it's really working for you right now. We wanted to let you stay in that, but the incentive to staying in it is if there would be bonuses associated with those governments that you wanted to hang on to a little bit longer. So we were getting somewhere, but we still had one big problem with the CIVICS system. And that was the fact that the way I sort of hadn't really described how you move into a government, how you slot in a policy, but we had this really cumbersome system that all of this was done by spending culture, and you would sort of accumulate a treasury of culture, just like you do of gold. And every time you want to make some type of governmental change, you would just grab some culture from that culture treasury and apply it to the problem, and all of a sudden, boom, you'd be able to switch governments or slot in a policy. One that sort of felt weird, because accumulations of culture sitting around for thousands of years waiting to be spent, that doesn't make much sense in the real world. And then the other thing that was happening was we were having problems where you'd spend all your culture, get your government set up right, and then something would happen in the game world. We were tying everything to the game world, and something would happen, and it would be the situation where, oh wow, I just unlocked this new government. Oh, I don't have any culture left to switch into it. And so even though it would seem like the right time to make one of these cultural shifts, you couldn't do it with this spending down from your culture treasury that we had going. So we finally kind of took the big step in the right direction with CIVICS system version 4. And this was something where we finally went ahead and created the parallel civics tree that anyone who's played Civ 6 has seen. This is an idea that had been kicking around. We had talked about doing this probably for a full year before we actually switched over to it. And we were wrapped around the idea that, civics has to be done different than technology. It has to be something that feels more cultural. It can't feel like technology. But if you look at the technology tree, that sort of is a gaming construct put on top of science. And that gaming construct works actually very, very well for us here, because now you don't have to have individual unlocks for each policy. You can have the policies unlocked in a bundle when you finish one of these civic nodes that are the equivalent of technology nodes. We can associate boosts with the whole civic, and so those little unlocks that we had that were from doing things out in the game world, now those could, we wouldn't have to have as many of them, maybe a third to a quarter as many of them, but we could still have that type of system. So in general, as soon as we finally made the switch over to the CIVICS system, things started to fall into place. Now, this particular CIVICS tree, which is the very first CIVICS tree we tried, did have some problems. If you look at it, the pink nodes, again, this is, apologies for my Visio art skills, because they're just Visio art. But the pink ones are required, the white ones are optional. And you can see, you can just blow through the ancient age pretty quickly. There are only 3 nodes in the whole ancient area CIVICS tree that you have to go for. We also had governments all out on their individual nodes, so you can sort of pick and choose from those, and so you ended up skipping a lot of the classical tree too. And in general, there wasn't much decision making to your path on this tree. There was pretty much one path to follow, with maybe a few choices, but we needed to make this tree richer and deeper and more varied. So that's sort of how we ended up with our final CIVICS tree, is we went ahead and created something that looks like the tech tree. And it was really fun. This was one of the fun exercises of Civ 6, was trying to reimagine all the improvements that societies and governments and cultures have made through the year, and what those look like in terms of how they interrelate to each other, which ones lead into other ones. And so we ended up with a tree like this. This is showing it later in the game. And the government screen here, where we finally came up with that time where you finish research on a new civic. And actually, we never called it researching a civic. We felt like that was the wrong term. You only research technologies. So internal to the team, we came up with this term that you research technologies, but you cultivate civics. And so you'll actually, if you dive deeply enough into the XML and the files, you'll see all these references to cultivating. That was our favorite term. We ended up almost shipping the game and telling people that they were cultivating, even though that's not a real word, and it only makes sense in this very, very specific context. But if you guys want to start using cultivate, I totally approve of it. It's one of my favorite words of the last 3 or 4 years, so go for it. Okay, so 2 more problems to go through, and then we can get on to questions. And these last 2 are areas where probably Civ 5 took a lot of heat, and some of it was deserved, and some of it we agreed with, so that's why it made it onto our list of top 5 problems with Civ 5. And that's the 1 unit per tile system. I absolutely loved it. It brought tactical nuance to the game, but it also brought some problems. So let's look at the biggest one of those, which was unit congestion. And so if you look at this particular screenshot, right here I'm pointing to a mobile surface-to-air missile unit, and really its main purpose in the game. It can defend, so you can sort of use it as a defensive troop if you need to, but it's pretty much its main purpose in the game is to shoot down aircraft. But in this particular configuration, it's sitting there occupying one of the key tiles that the Aztec army needs to approach Kathmandu and to capture that city. So it's in the way, it's blocking things, and that's just part of, kind of the repeat problem that we kept seeing in Civ 5 games, was that people were having their units fall on top of each other, stumbling upon themselves, and they couldn't get a clear path to what they were trying to get to with their military. You also notice on this map that it's a cool looking map. It's got a lot of interest. Kathmandu's in this really strategic position, right where all these peninsulas come together. But those strategic positions right where the peninsula come together are also the worst places for unit congestion. So in this kind of situation where you're trying to attack it, it actually becomes pretty frustrating. So we wanted to look at that. And that was something that wasn't too tricky to solve as long as we just sort of attack that problem directly from a design point of view. So we added 3 different things. Let's skip ahead to the next slide. And I'll go back to, so we had 3 things. We added support units. So now all those mobile surface-to-air missiles, anything that is not a frontline fighting unit, but you want to have in your army, was going to be something that could be stacked with other units, and that was going to help with the unit congestion. and it was also going to be able to move as a grouped unit with your other military units. And then the other thing that we did was we allowed you to group units of the same type together into corps and armies. That was immediately going to reduce in that one localized area the amount of map congestion we had by a factor of 2 or 3. But we were very deliberate about that decision. We didn't want to go back to the mixed stacks that Civ 4 had, because then you started losing the clarity as to, is he sending his mounted troops around my flank? Does he have his melee units up in the front that are guarding ranged units behind them? So we wanted to be very careful to maintain that sort of tactical rock, paper, scissors nuance to what was happening on the battlefield, but we wanted to collapse units together and let them occupy the same tiles. So you can see that not only do we have the helicopter army here, but we also have naval units that are grouped into corps and armies. We just happen to call them fleets and armadas. So in general, this definitely helped with the overstacking problem, and we felt like we were able to kind of bring things out in the map, and we're allowed to have those kind of cool choke points like I was showing on that progression up to Kathmandu, and it was going to be okay in our game. Okay, and now I'm getting to the 5th item, and this problem is something that probably is, the solution we came up with here is probably the most controversial of the solutions. We've had members, even internal to our development team, that were telling us, just a couple months before we were shipping, that we were making a huge mistake with the decision that we made for Civ 6 here, because it was going to confuse too many players and we shouldn't do it. But if you think about what I've been emphasizing here, is I wanted to make sure that the map was important in your games of Civilization 6. I wanted to make sure that the use of all the tiles around your city was important. I wanted to make sure that you had to think about where you were in the world in terms of which technology boosts and civic boosts you could unlock. Maybe you don't have stone nearby you. You cannot go into masonry as early and get the pyramids. Like if that's your big plan to how to get ahead in the ancient era and there's no stone or there's no desert nearby, you can't actually get the pyramids in this game. So we had done these things through the unstacking the cities, through the tech boost system, that were really helping us bring the map out to a preeminent role in Civilization 6. And what we didn't want to do was let people kind of get away from understanding the map and appreciating the map and realizing the importance of the map. And so there was this thing that had happened in all Civilization games with movement rules that I called cheating the terrain. And the problem there, if you look at this screenshot right here, you'll see that we have a Indonesian Chris swordsman in Civ 5. He's only got 1 movement point left because he's already moved into this clear terrain space that he occupies right now. But despite the fact he only has 1 movement point left and should not be able to get anywhere except for another clear terrain space, according to the rules of Civ 5, doesn't really matter. He can just dive in there. He can go into either the desert hills that are highlighted with the blue circle or into the woods to the west. And that actually led to this really sort of awkward movement strategy in Civ 5, where what you want to do with your guys is always end their turn in difficult terrain, because then they have better defensive bonuses. And you can do things like you can scoot down a valley where the terrain's nice and clear, and then on your final movement, jump up onto the wooded hill and see way off into the distance as you're scouting the terrain. So especially when you're scouting the map, and especially when you're worrying about defending, you always want your last move to be in this impossibly difficult terrain that should cost a lot of movement points. And it was fighting against people's appreciation of the map. So what I wanted to do for Civ 6 was change that. And one thing that I noticed about Civ 5 before we leave Civ 5 is in order to get this blue movement skirt around the unit that highlights the places you can go, you had to know to click on the special move mode button, and only if you turned on the move mode would you get the ability to see the valid hexes your unit can move to. Otherwise, you would just right-click and just move there. So we got to Civ 6, and I proposed we're going to have new movement rules. They're going to actually enforce the proper movement point costs for terrain, and you're going to have to pay that much to go in there. And I put it in, and everyone hated it. They just felt like, I don't know why my guy only, he's got one movement point left. I want to be able to do something with it. It just was confusing players. The turns weren't ending right. I got a whole bunch of flack from the team internally, and if I struggled with the CIVICS system getting that right, this was one where I was just actually getting people coming in telling me that I was absolutely taking the franchise in the wrong direction and I needed to change this now. So I thought about this some more, and I did not want to give up to it. And luckily, I had 2 or 3 other allies in my design office who appreciated why we were making this change, loved this change, and were really willing to stick it out with me and work through until we had this working properly. And so eventually, sort of long story short, what ended up being the key thing that made me comfortable with the way we were going to proceed here was I started thinking about Firaxis' sister game, XCOM. And I started thinking about movement in XCOM. And there's a lot of complicated moves you make in XCOM. I don't know how many of you guys play XCOM, but you go up and down ladders, you jump off buildings, there are like multiple levels. There's different types of terrain you have to go around. And I don't understand, I play XCOM all the time. I love XCOM. It's what I do sort of when I get a break from Civ. I go off and play XCOM for a while because it's a different strategy game that's got very, very different rules. But I have no idea how the XCOM movement system works. I have no idea how you spend points for that, what your range is. And I don't need to know as a player because when I have a unit selected, it just shows me a blue movement boundary for everywhere I can go, and I just click on one of the hexes in that area. And all of a sudden, that just works. That's my move for that guy for that turn. I don't need to know the specifics of how much everything costs. And so what we did is we took that blue boundary that you saw in Civ 5 was only available when you went in that special movement mode, and we made it always a part of how you made a move in Civ 6. As soon as the unit's selected, that boundary's going to show, and you know where all the valid tiles are. And when you're in this situation like shown on the screenshot here where you only have one movement point left, the boundary will shrink down to just where he can go sort of for the second part of his move. So we put that in, and all of a sudden our user tests were coming back. People understood it, they got it. Things were looking like we could actually ship the game and have this system in place. People were going to be able to have the proper appreciation of the map that I wanted. So let's see where that leaves us. So I'm listing 4 different things here on the left side of the screen. Pretty much the 4 major problem areas that we'd identified from Civ 5 when we'd sort of taken a hard look at ourselves and kind of been real critical to figure out what we need to change for Civ 6. The only one that's not listed there is the CIVICS system, which is not really necessarily directly part of map-driven play, but it does respond to that overarching goal I had about having to think on your feet and not having a single path through the game, because the CIVICS system lets you reconfigure what you're doing with your empire and sort of launch yourself into a new phase of the game that's going to be aligned with your new short-term goal. But if you look at these 4 things here, I think in all 4 of these areas, we really decided that the best way for us to hit this primary goal of making it so that you're going to have to think on your feet more and have a more customized experience each time you play, because you're going to have to redo your strategy. All 4 of these items contributed to it, and they all brought it out through driving the play through the map. So one of the things I love about what we did with Civ 6 is not only was the map important to the gameplay, but we sort of followed that mapping motif with our artwork. So you can see here, not only does the Fog of War look like an ancient map, it was sort of that old parchment-y look, but we actually, it's not shown on this screenshot, but we actually themed the user interface. The heads-up display has sort of a Age of Exploration theme to it as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to go over today. I think because we have a little bit of extra time, I can still take at least 10 minutes of questions. And I thank you for coming out to the talk. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I really want to sneak 2 questions in, but I was here with Sid and I asked him, like my favorite part of the franchise is the Civ 1, the end of game, replay, really tied together like this accomplishment over 30 hours, and I was wondering why that disappeared.
Yep, and I was here for that session. Sid apologized that he had thrown me under the bus because he had not answered your question, but I'm happy to answer that question. I'm not sure whether I'm going to do a talk like this in the couple years at GDC, but one thing that has been clear to me as we've been working on Civilization 6 is that the process of rolling out a new title in the Civilization franchise, it's a 5-6 year proposition. And we have to make a lot of decisions about where everything is going to hit during that rollout and what's the right things for the base game and which things maybe we have plans down the road in the future to really do a great job with. And so some of the support that might be expected will come down the road. So I just ask you to be patient because we actually, it may look like we don't care about replay systems at all, but it's actually something that is still very forefront in our thinking.
Okay. And second, so what is the process for iterating on design on a game that takes 30 hours to play?
It's tricky, and there are a lot of ways we sort of cheat that. If you look at the fact that some of the setup options in the Civilization game, I don't think our players ever use or use very, very rarely, but they're instrumental to what the team does in terms of us being able to iterate on things. So for instance, we have what we call our advanced starts, where you can start a game in the Renaissance or start a game in the Industrial Era. We use those all the time. That's how you can just dive into a part of the tech tree and see how it's playing. You can try out air combat without having to play for 5 hours to get to it. So there are tricks and techniques like that that we've sort of adopted over the time, and some of those are like built in as options that players don't use very often, but the development team uses quite a bit.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Arthur. I'm working at Amplitude Studio. We are creating game like Endless Legend, Firaxis Game. First of all, congratulations for this amazing sequel.
Thanks.
Really. So I really like the tech boost system. But after some games, I just realized that even me, who are not really an optimizer player, I was starting to trying to achieve all the conditions to have all the boosts. And at the end, I just have all these units that I don't really want and this improvement in my city that I don't really choose. And I don't know if you thought about that and maybe thought about a more random system for this boost.
Civ 6 can be a bit of a frustrating experience for somebody who wants to try to achieve sort of that perfect game and optimize everything. There's a lot of things that we deliberately put in your way to make it so you can't have the perfect setup. So you can't get all the wonders. You have to make trade-offs about how you're going to use the tiles outside your city. Sometimes it's the science campus tile up against the mountains that you want to use for that gets pilfered to put in your holy site or a wonder that has a specific requirement. So yeah, I realized that we sort of made the choice to force people away from having sort of a perfect layout and a perfect plan. But if you look at what I was going for here in terms of trying to make people have to adjust and not be able to rely on the same strategy every time, I think that's sort of, you end up there no matter what. Okay.
So I actually was going to come up and say that I really hated the movement system, but you apparently went over that right at the end of the talk. Yeah, even yesterday in my playthrough, I was trying to go into a forest and my dude stopped, and then I lost a city, and I was like, you movement system. But actually, my question to you is slightly less game mechanic based and more about the Civilopedia. So in Civ 5, Civ 6, you guys introduced religion and did a lot more things. And one of my favorite parts of Civ has always been the Civilopedia because it's text that we've actually learned from over the years. And I feel that in Civ 6, a lot of the Civilopedia entries and a lot of the tech research entries that you get, the quotes that come up when, they seem a lot more snarky, snide, almost kind of mocking the thing that you either discovered or are trying to research. It seems a little bit more hurtful, I guess, than you would expect from a Civ game. And I was just concerned with, I guess, or wondering what the design behind that was.
Yeah, we've gotten that feedback before. It's certainly not the first time I've heard that. And if you came to Sid's talk, you can see that even in Sid 1, they were wrestling with what's the right balance between sort of respectful, true historical treatment and humor. And there probably are some areas where we missed the bar a little bit on Civ 6. So we'll definitely learn from that. Yeah. I don't think we've made a permanent shift in one direction. I think that's something where you try some things out, some things work, some things the community pushes back a little bit, and that's probably an area where we learned a little bit more about what the community really likes.
Yeah, and also, you guys misspelled Guru Nanak's name in the Civilization entry for Sikhism, and I feel that that's a 10-second Google search, maybe. You could fix the major important leader.
Well, we'd absolutely love to fix it. And we do that all the time. We go back, and if people email us or whatever, tweet me, whatever, we go back in and we patch up everything because we know that people are going to be playing Civ 6 5 years, 10 years, hopefully, from now, and so we might as well get it right for people all the way down the road. So send those on to us. There's a lot of text in this game. It gets localized into over 13 languages. Things like that do happen.
Hi, how are you? I've played all the Civ series from 1 through 6, and I want to congratulate you that Civ 6 really feels very much part of the series, and it's actually a very good game in the series. So I've been very impressed by it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Before I get to my question, like in the earlier presentation, I did bring up a question about to Sid, but I wanted to bring it back again to social responsibility as a game developer. As an industry as a whole, I think we want to be moving towards more of that, and I think Firaxis this game really can play a big role in that, and I would like to see a bit more on the educational aspects to be highlighted, and kind of in the tune of the Wikipedia question as well. I think we're losing a bit of that, and especially in this day and age, it's important to bring more of that back. So I'd encourage more of that. My question is how you guys understand what users are doing with the game. So I heard a lot from you about listening to the community via the forums, but how much are you also looking at actual usage of the game and analytics in terms of how people are actually playing the game, and how do you balance that with what people are demanding on the forums?
Okay, and I just remembered I'm supposed to be repeating the questions for the Forum Vault video for this, so I'll start that right now. The question was, how do we use analytics and look not only at what the community is saying, but actually some raw data from how the game is being played to inform our decisions going forward. So we are definitely looking at that. We did not have a full telemetry system coming back from the game in Civilization 5, but we have put that in for Civilization 6. So all of a sudden, we do start to get aggregate data. We don't ever focused on any particular user, but we get aggregate data for like how often certain tech boosts get triggered, which civilizations people are playing, which types of victory are they going for. And it's actually, I know that's a new trend in games, is to get that kind of telemetry in there, but it's already very, very clear to us that this is a huge new tool that's going to help us going forward, and it should make us able to tune and really get Civ 6 to the best possible place, without having to make as many guesses as we had to make in the past. So it's a great question, and it's definitely something that we're focused on. We also run a whole series of focus tests before the game ships. That's another great source of data about how people are playing the game and what they're struggling with. So yeah, I'm noticing that it's sort of a whole new world in terms of having that kind of supporting data to really influence your decisions. Some of what I showed you here was designer instinct and maybe not necessarily based on data. But I think you need a combination of the two to really move forward in the best possible way.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So can I take one more, or should we end it now? Okay. All right. That's it for questions, but I will still be up front, and I'll take your questions personally. Okay. Thank you.